its meaning and goals. My name is Marie. I will be co-moderating the session together with Anna. I work for the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. Anna is policy analyst at FEPS. The structure of today's panel is the following. We will begin with a short scene-setting input of about 10 minutes. This will be followed by a first round of structured inputs from the panelists. And after that, we will open the floor to all of you. So feel free to prepare any points that you would like to raise during the discussion. We will collect some of them and then hand them over back to our speakers for the reactions. Before introducing our first speakers, I would like to briefly set the context. At the beginning of this mandate, Mario Draghi published his report on the future of European competitiveness. And building on this, the Competitiveness Compass translated some of his recommendations into the timeline and highlights the key economic policy initiatives that are planned for this mandate. Vice President Séjourné presented this compass as the economic doctrine for the next 5 years and summed it up in the 3 words: competitiveness, competitiveness, competitiveness. So now we are 1 year from the Draghi report, and the theme remains highly present everywhere in Brussels. In the State of the Union address, von der Leyen repeatedly emphasized competitiveness. The president of the workers' group in the ESC even stated that competitiveness must become the organizing principle of EU policymaking. So in short, competitiveness is everywhere. With this panel, we want to take a step back and critically reflect on the concept, especially given how it's sometimes used politically to advance initiatives that are often otherwise difficult to sell, such as deregulation efforts packed into so-called omnibus proposals. With this being said, I would like to hand over to our scene setter, Patrick, who will give the input first. He is a postdoc researcher at University Mannheim, and he has also very recently published a paper for FES on exactly this topic. Anna and I, we will try to be very strict with the time management, so please, everybody, limit your speaking time. Vanessa will share the slides exactly, and Patrick, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It will be difficult to get it done within 10 minutes, but I'll do my best. As mentioned, I want to take a step back, and in fact, when you look at the Draghi report and a discourse that he held just prior to its publication, what was interesting was that he referred to an article from Paul Krugman from 1994, which was titled "The Dangerous Obsession with Competitiveness." And a lot of the critique that I will present here conceptually is already in that article and was also adopted by Mario Draghi. So it was mentioned that competitive now is pretty much everywhere, and one of the things is that this has been pretty much the case from the very start of the European Union. So the Maastricht Treaty, the Lisbon strategy, where Europe wanted to become the most competitive area in the world. During the Eurozone crisis, we were talking a lot about competitiveness. And now, again, competitiveness is center stage. Often the demands are that we need to lower wages, that wages are too high. We need to deregulate, we need to cut taxes, and so on and so forth to become more competitive. And yeah, the question that I ask is that, is competitiveness really a meaningful compass for Europe's future? And the first thesis that I think is absolutely crucial to answer that question is that we know what we are saying when we use the term competitiveness. So one definition that I have selected is a firm, or in this case a country's, relative ability in comparison with other firms and countries to sell and supply goods and services. So it is a relative concept. It is not an absolute goal. I mean, if you want to put it next level, you could ask the same about the world economy, right? The world as such cannot, or as a closed economy, cannot become more or less competitive. And it's a zero-sum game when we're just talking about competitiveness. So it is a critical subject to the fallacy of composition. What might apply to one country does not apply to the system as a whole, right? And the same applies to firms. So if a firm, for example, is lowering its wages by keeping productivity constant, it can reduce its unit labor costs. But if all firms are doing that, then wages go down, demand goes down, and the economy is then struggling. And the same applies to when we talk about competitiveness of entire countries. One country's gain is another one's loss. A good example to illustrate that is, for example, currency revaluations, right? If one country depreciates, so this is of course also a way to increase competitiveness just by devaluating the currency. This is necessarily, by definition, an appreciation of another country's exchange rate. So it is impossible for everyone to become more competitive. That's the first message. Then when you have that, you can ask, okay, so what should be the actual objective? And this is where I put productivity center stage. Productivity is an absolute goal, and it's pretty much the only lever that we have to increase living standards in the long run. Coming from a Schumpeterian background, investments are of course key for that, to lead to a restructuring of the productive base, so a new combination of input factors, labor and capital, not an optimization as it is usually assumed in neoclassical economic theory, that firms and agents optimize their production structure, but that's a new combination, so not something that's or something that's that hasn't been done before, which is then implemented by innovative firms, the so-called pioneers. And when you have wage cuts without structural change, this is then where the obsession with competitiveness can lead to a race to the bottom. So the actual quality of competition is decisive, and when we think about productivity in relative terms. If you say, look, every country should increase their competitiveness, their productivity, this is possible, right? Every country can increase their productivity. If you say every country should become more competitive, this is logically not possible. So when we look at the European Union, I put EU here in the slide. Eurozone would be more accurate. The main focus was on cost reduction rather than innovations and investment. This was leading then to weak domestic demand, and foreign trade was not able to compensate for that, because this is another thing that we need to keep in mind, the distance effect of trade. So trade decreases with distance. The rule of thumb there is you double the distance, you halve the trade. And domestic demand is a lot more important for domestic growth in larger economies compared to external demand. When we look at the figures here, we can see that the only years pretty much in which foreign demand outpaced domestic demand in terms of contributions to GDP growth were the years during the Eurozone crisis, which of course weakened internal demand to an extent that it led to a worse overall GDP growth performance. I put the US just aside that, where you see how domestic demand was basically fueling growth, and foreign demand, was a drag on growth, but it was largely offset by what was basically consumed domestically. So, in my opinion, it's more of a strategic gap, not one of competitiveness, that we have in Europe. We have a lack of coordination and industrial policy strategy. We have had asymmetric crisis policy after the Eurozone crisis, where we were also talking about more competitiveness, and the main mechanism was fiscal adjustment, internal devaluation, pressure on wages, with basically countries trying to reach the German level. What we see here, of course, is that with the crises that we had in the last few years, with inflation and so on, that somewhat offset the larger developments. But I put here Germany, France, and Italy as exemplary cases for what was happening in Europe. And we saw that in Italy, for example, unit labor costs were rising much faster than in the rest of Europe. That was also the case in other southern European countries. And without a mechanism to adjust the exchange rates, that obviously led to a loss of competitiveness. Whereas other countries, most importantly Germany, was restraining wage growth, and that increased their competitiveness. So that created the huge imbalances in Europe. And following the Eurozone crisis, what you can clearly see is that countries, even countries like France, which was basically on track with its unit labor cost development in relation to the ECB inflation target, they were all trying to kind of internally devalue in order to become more competitiveness and close the gap to the German hyper-competitiveness in that sense. So what Europe really needs is more of a growth strategy, and thereby, of course, the model of competition that we have will be structured in a way that the competitiveness of each country ideally remains constant to avoid the emergence of imbalances. What we need is to understand that competition should be between companies, not between states, and that also relates, of course, to regulations on taxes, environmental standards, labor standards, and so on and so forth. So the paradox that I put forward is that for more competitiveness in a sense to relation to the US and China, it is more important that Europe will focus less on becoming or on trying to drive every country to become more competitive. And some particular policy tools that one could use, for example, when we look at how do countries, or how can countries increase their competitiveness, is basically via two ways. Firms do the same pretty much. So you can either increase your productivity, or you can keep productivity constant and lower your wages. And in Europe, we need to get to a model where the increases in productivity become the only tool, basically, to increase competitiveness. And with nominal wages then adjusting to new productivity levels, that would then offset the differences in competitiveness. So countries that, for instance, do not have, I don't know, big policy pushes towards increasing their productivity, who do not invest, and so on and so forth, they do not fall behind because nominal wages and living standards will not increase as much as in those countries that invest. But in order to institutionalize such a competition, one needs to move away from the obsession with competitiveness more towards how do we structure economic competition between countries so that we have ideally strong unions, so that differences in profitability between the firms in a given sector are determined by differences in productivity and not by lowering wages. Because otherwise, I mean, to give you another example, if one company increases its productivity by 10%, unit labor costs fall by 10%. And then another company could say, oh, okay, so now we need to lower wages by 10%, and then we're exactly on the same unit labor cost level. But one company had to innovate, the other didn't. So we need to make sure that innovation and productivity gains will remain the primary lever for competition. And that, of course, requires much broader economic and institutional cooperation between the different countries. So it's the quality of competition that is decisive, and not the level of competitiveness of the Eurozone as a whole.
Thank you so much, Patrick. So I think we have a really good now setting for the discussion, with also sort of provocative or maybe not so provocative statements and proposals. And so now I would like to briefly introduce our panel. So I will just, in the order of seating, and we have Estelle Goeger, who is a member of Cabinet of the Commissioner Séjourné, who is dealing exactly with these issues, with industrial policy and competitiveness. Then next is Matthias Ecke, who is a member of European Parliament. He is also a member of the ITRE committee, dealing exactly also with these issues, industry and energy. Then after Patrick is Lúcio Vinhas de Souza, who is now chief economist in Business Europe, but he has also big experience in other institutions. He was in the Washington, in World Bank, and also other institutions, in the European Commission before. Then Isabelle Schömann, Deputy General Secretary of European Trade Union Confederation. And last but not least is Lorenzo Moretti, who is a research fellow at the European University Institute and Italy lead and head of advisory in Lewis Hub for New Industrial Policy and Economic Governance. His particular field of expertise is digital and financial sector. So with this quick introduction, I would like now just immediately pass to Estelle and basically ask you to react a little bit to this speech, in particular to reflect a bit on what should be actually the goal of European policy. So we talk now about competitiveness, but as we see, it has many definitions. So, and should it be competitiveness? And by the way, what happened to the notion of competitive sustainability, which was the goal of the previous von der Leyen Commission? So why don't we keep that one as a goal? So why do we need to change these definitions? What do you think should be the goal now?
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for setting the scene. I'm really looking forward to the discussion because the panel is very diverse. So, you know, between academia, social partners, policy makers. So I think it will really shed light on different facets and aspects of competitiveness because indeed, as you said, it's about the quality of competitiveness, and competitiveness is also a kind of a moving target, I have the impression. And there is, of course, a very political look on competitiveness. There are a lot of things that you said that I agree with. If I pick just a couple of elements about the internal devaluation, that is very true. But at the same time, for me, this was more the context of the financial crisis and the euro area crisis. Then the EU, we moved a bit away from that. Typically, if you look at what happened at the end of COVID with the Next Generation EU, with a kind of stimulus plan, or the attempt of having a stimulus plan, I think that there were lessons learned and that the reaction was different, and there was an attempt to trigger demand. Who mainly benefited from Next Gen EU, I mean, is still to be seen. The jury is out. We'll have to continue to implement, but we as a Commission, we start looking also at, for instance, how China benefited from Next Generation EU, because the broad rollout of solar panels or these kind of things, in the end, we bought them Chinese. So we might back then have introduced criteria to maybe support more European industries. But so I think that there has been a change compared to what you explained. And then on the fact that competitiveness should be between companies and not states. Of course, at the same time, yes, we should not be competing as EU and within the single market. But there is a global competition out there, and that we cannot deny. And the problem is that this competition is not fair. And so part of what the Commission is trying to do, or what policymakers at European level and also member state level have to try to do, is to create a favorable business environment. To what degree you call this deregulation or not, I mean, that will also be part of the discussion, but look at what are the framework conditions that are needed for companies, small and big, but also how to try to reestablish a form of level playing field. And here we have to make a better use of our trade defense instruments, I think, and also look at inserting local content requirement. I think that we are moving towards this. Coming to the term competitive sustainability, that was more prominent indeed under the last mandate. The thing is that I think it's still there, but what happened since 5 years ago, really at the beginning of the last mandate, when this was put forward, I think with the first European semester cycle under the last mandate, the thing is that then you had COVID, you had the war in Ukraine, the IRA, then Trump, and China flooding us with overcapacities. So all of this, I think, led to the fact that in addition to the sustainability dimension that still remains very important, we also looked more at resilience, at open strategic autonomy. Now it's more strategic autonomy and made in Europe. So here as well we are shifting. There are different nuances of grey always. I mean, it's by the week that these things are shifting. And so I think that we've broadened the scope and that competitiveness, at least this is from the perspective of the EVP that I work for and whose portfolio name is Industrial Strategy, Prosperity and Industrial Strategy. So this is the aim. And competitiveness is a means to reach these policy aims and objectives, and what really makes a bit the European model as well. So I would say that we've added different notions and that competitiveness is really a means. And then I will decline a bit later on in the discussion on policy actions.
Thank you very much. Then next I would like to hand over to Matthias Ecke. You can maybe react to what you've heard, and if you would like, you can answer the question, in your view, what would be the ingredients to increase productivity in Europe, and are the Commission initiatives in this mandate helpful to achieve this?
Yeah, thank you for the invitation, and also Patrick for the scene setter. I think we'll have a very lively discussion about it. Well, I would say that, of course, competitiveness has become the magic word in Brussels and kind of a single solution for all the problems from slow growth to inflation, some even say to climate change. But in fact, the problem is more nuanced, and I also think that it is an analytic tool that can be helpful in some, I would say, rather limited aspects, but it should not misguide us into policies that have diametrical impact on our productivity growth, because I think basically productivity growth is the main objective that we should follow with our policies. And I think this, if we look at Draghi's report, this is one of the parts that I really like best, because he's really pointing out that we lost on productivity growth, that we lost on what can be economically called total factor productivity, so what with the same input that you get more output. And this is due to a lack of innovation in some key sectors. We really fall behind on innovation, on like new products, new ways of producing, new services, rearranging the existing like factor inputs that we have. So this is something that Draghi was right about. I wouldn't say that we can solve this problem with internal devaluation, so I completely agree with Patrick on that respect. On the other hand, I do not consider the Commission's answer to the problems we have to be based around devaluation, with one exception, and that one exception is the entire deregulation simplification agenda. So this is something that is very prominent in the Commission's initiative, also in the policy demands from stakeholders, and maybe there's also some point to it. I think that there might have been some over-regulation in some policy areas. When we look back to the last mandate, so we correct for some things. So now we corrected for the CBAM, for example, and now we say, okay, we cover 99% of the emissions and leave out 90% of the companies. So my question is, okay, why didn't we do that in the last mandate? Yeah? So this seems like simplification that is necessary and reasonable. I don't think that a deregulation on sustainable development goals, on climate policies, on social standards especially, and also consumer protection rights is the way to go. So the focus should be on innovation and on investment. And I think that mostly this focus is also shared by the Commission and also by Commissioner Séjourné, that we need to become more productive because we need to become, while becoming and through becoming more innovative. So this means that it's a sectoral thing. So we have some deficiencies in certain sectors, especially in the digital economy, and this is where we should put our focus on. It's also a thing of a coordinated industrial strategy. So you mentioned the portfolio name of Stéphane Séjourné, and it's interesting that he's a commissioner, or vice president for industrial strategy, which somehow felt for me like maybe we didn't have really an industrial strategy before, which means that we also need more than just having national strategies put together on one sheet of paper, but we really have to do a coordination. We have some of the tools that the Commission proposed, like, for example, the European Competitiveness Fund, there we have the name again, is something that is aiming at that because it is from the centralized budget, so we don't have so much problems with the state aid rules, and we don't have so much problems with internal market distortions. And this one is also focused on specific technologies. To what degree, we still discuss. But this is things that are really focused on investment, on innovation. And we also have the startups and scale-up topic. This is something that we are focusing much in this mandate. And we really need to reduce obstacles that prevent startups from growing. But especially we need to keep them here and we need to avoid them going elsewhere. And last but not least, I think the question of financial markets, deep European financial markets is something that is important, savings and investments union, because we quite often have very smart ideas and interesting young companies that move away basically to the US to scale up their model. So this is something we should work on, but we should not go to the wrong direction by internal devaluation, by reducing wages, by not skilling the workers, because they are our potential, they are innovative, they contribute to our growth. I think Europe has an interesting model about its like social partner relations. That is one of our biggest assets institutionally, and this is something that we should use as a tool for more productivity and should not be handled as an obstacle to competitiveness. Thanks.
Thank you, Matthias. Now we go next to Lúcio, and I would be really curious to hear your reactions, Lúcio, to this. Like, how you define competitiveness? Is this productivity, and also how to achieve it? And I would be curious to see also, like, maybe you can say, how do we know that we have become competitive? So what are the measures?
Many thanks, Anne. Okay, voila, on y va. Many thanks. Allow me to start by making a small conceptual point. I think that we lost the image of the slide, at least on my screen. I think that we should be careful in not to engage in what amounts to a academic discussion mixing terms to create a straw man which then complicates policy choices at the European Union level. I say that as someone that at some point in the beginning of my career was a trade economist, albeit from a Ricardian comparative advantage type of background. Call me a new Ricardian if you wish, in which I do see the world in terms of relative comparative advantages, which is a concept that enables all countries to gain, even if there is one particular country that is more competitive than everybody else in all sectors. Because, in relative terms, there is always going to be a guy producing some good which is less inefficient, so you can get market there. This has the very logical implication that you don't frame a concept as a zero-sum game, which, from the point of view of articulating relations, can be quite complex. If you allow me another conceptual point, as somebody that was actually the chief economist of Moody's during the euro area crisis, I have a different interpretation of the adjustment mechanisms of the countries of the euro area during that particular moment. This said, I think that we all agree that the fundamental problem that we face, you can call it different concepts, is a question of the fundamental productivity of the European economy. And that is, I think, an undeniable fact that we all have to agree, because it has concrete implications in terms of the quality of life of our citizens and the fundamental sustainability of the European social model. We don't want competitiveness, and I am unashamedly using the term here, for competitiveness' sake. We want it because it makes the life of our citizens better. Companies which are more competitive enable the financial sustainability of the European social model. If we don't have them, we simply cannot afford the typical and extremely unique social contract that we have in the European Union. Now, I will give you an example of how we have stagnated in terms of our relation in two other areas of the world in which we are competing. We have two examples here, the United States and the People's Republic of China. I'm using the United States as an implicit comparator because that's the most intuitive one, a large market-based economy which essentially works via market principles, which is what the European Union is in the end of the day. We have essentially stagnated in terms of GDP per capita in relation to the United States for the past 30 years. Compare this with other regions of the world. The example here is the People's Republic of China, which during the same period of time increased by a factor of 10 in terms of GDP per capita for its citizens. This implies the quality of life that those citizens have in relation to others. We have a real problem in terms of growth, and what determines growth? Hence, we go to the discussion concerning productivity. I see competition as something that you can use to enforce gains of productivity between companies in a given integrated economic space. And I believe that that's essentially what we should be talking about here. The real problem that we have in terms of the European Union is our dismal performance in terms of total factor productivity. I'm an economist. I love acronyms, right, like everybody. This I would call a TFP, but then I realized that most people here probably wouldn't get it, so I actually spelled it out. What this thing is actually telling you is that we have an increased deficit in terms of total factor productivity in relation to two large economic comparator areas on planet Earth, again, the United States and the People's Republic of China. As a matter of fact, during the period that you have there, which is a 75-year-long period, our TFP growth in relation to the United States is less than 1/3 that they had during the aggregated period. Our average growth, I'm using here the European Union as an average, was roughly 0.5 per year. The United States was 1.7 throughout the period. As a small point, I'm using here an adjusted GDP series because anybody that has ever worked with macroeconomic data for China knows that when you do aggregation at sectoral level, it actually doesn't add up to the aggregated totals of GDP in China, so you actually have to adjust that. So our fundamental problem is factor productivity. Productivity, if you wish, right? Which is something that can be supported by proper competition policies among other structural types of policies, right? That's a little joke that I have in relation to, I am a European Commission official on a leave of absence. We have this tradition of writing reports about the increasing amount of problems that we have in the European Union. As what you see there, there is a direct inverse relationship between the number of pages on the reports and our share in global GDP. No. Allow me to finalize in what I think is our fundamental problem, and I'm pivoting here to the question of the fundamentally non-integrated nature of the European Union single market. We don't have integrated markets. That means that in the end of the day, a company that innovates, that creates a new product, a new process, when it will go to a scale-up stage, we are actually quite good in terms of basic innovation, but we really are not up to standards in terms of scale-up. We don't scale up here. We scale up in truly integrated markets. When I worked for President Juncker, when I did his first economic strategy, I did a graph that he loved. I measured the depth of the European single market by exports between member states, which was around 21% of GDP in the European Union. You do that in the United States, benchmarking imports and exports between the US states is 80% of GDP, right? Our single market is single in a very limited way. And that is not only for goods, but for services and finance. We don't have a euro area bank after 20 years after we created the euro area. Our pools of liquidity are essentially national ones. We don't have integrated markets. Because we don't have integrated markets, our productivity is disappointing, we don't grow, we lose global market share. Policies that address this fundamental question of the barriers for companies to grow and productively invest in Europe are the fundamental problem that we have to address, and we can call it competitiveness. Productivity is the fundamental, the same basic problem. And if I allow me one small point, I know no single company in the European Union who actually has a business model based on low salaries, because we are not a low-cost location. Our companies, they have to compete in terms of innovation, because if not, the Chinese will always beat us. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Next, Isabelle Schömann, you can react to what has been said, and also, if you'd like, you can answer to the question, what does this focus on competitiveness mean for workers, and what does it also mean from a distributional perspective?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for your invitation, and sorry for being a bit late, stuck in the tube. That can happen. But happy to be part of these discussions, and I think this is important also to come back to a bit of a reality check, and of course to reassure that competitiveness as such, and we understand that's a kind of sexy concept back on the agenda with different definition. I think the issue of definition has been mentioned, so I will not repeat it. But competitiveness cannot be working and develop into a silo. And I just wanted to come back to a bit of basics, and I just would like to highlight why we are here in the European Union, what we should be doing in the European Union. And for that, the reference is not any Draghi report or any Letta report or any whatever report, which are very important, of course, to propose alternative ways, but not to set in stone what has to be done. But the reference that we should look at is the Treaty of the European Union. And I think the Treaty of the European Union, in its first articles, and especially the Article 3, mentioned that we are in a social market economy. And it says, but it remains an adjective, highly competitive. No problem with that. However, it still is a social market economy. And we have three aims to comply with. The first one is social progress. The second one is full employment. And the third one is the protections of the environment. So all of that, being a highly social market economy, is the aim of having social progress, the protection of the environment, and the full employment. It's not to do business at any price, and it's certainly not, indeed, to have a market that is running on itself. We know the market alone will not solve the problem, and this is the reasons why exactly what we should have, is a sustainable competitiveness concept. And the issue of sustainability is key, much more than the concept of competitiveness. And I will give you some example where, indeed, the need for giving a legal frame to this competitiveness issue, but to give a legal frame to the development of good businesses, sustainable businesses, is key. I could speak about the corporate sustainability due diligence. It's quite topical nowadays to speak of a U-turn in terms of how to address sustainability and, of course, how to create the fair competition base. and the level playing field for businesses to do business in a sustainable manner and not to use anything along the line of something which is identified by some as a cost, which should be an investment, in particular workers, in particular labour regulations. All of that has been acquired through very strong struggles and battles for social progress. So we are on the right track, and deregulation is not. However, when we see in the CSDDD, for example, is despite that we have created for the businesses, and with the European Union, on a very democratic process, we have created what was needed for a level playing field for businesses in European Union, using also the supply chain, so having an impact outside the European Union. We have created the framework to address the negative externalities of those business operations. And guess what? This is exactly the violations of human rights and the violations of workers' rights through the supply chain. This was the way to address it. How come that in 5 months this adopted legislation is put again on the table and is emptied when it comes exactly to the solution that was given for fair and sustainable competitiveness? So a bit of fear, question mark in our eyes, question mark in our minds, question mark in the way the social fabric and the very valid European social model on which the European Union is based, on which the European social model is based, on which the peace model of Europe is based, it's put at stake. It's one of the different examples that we could give in terms of indeed reassuring that labour is not a commodity. We wonder how come that here again the corporate sustainability directive has been put and traded in the US-EU agreement. How come that on the year of the adoption of this directive, there was already trade negotiations where the due diligence directive was indeed put in the basket of the negotiation. And at the end of the day, we understood that throughout the summer there was a deal, and now we have the text, and we understand that workers' rights and human rights are tradable. We cannot accept this kind of development. It is not in line with the rules and the line that the Treaty of the European Union is giving to us. And just to come back on elements of where there are stagnations, where there are lack of productivity, it's not because of labour regulation, it's not about the protections that are given for the workers. If we go back to two sectors, the batteries and the photovoltaic, the problem was not the regulation around startups being able to put a good product on the market and to test it. That's not the problem. The problem was the lack of investment from the European Union based on a competition policy that says, oh, no, you can't access too much public money because it's unfair competitions toward whom? China and the US. Do you think that China and the US do not support massively their businesses? They do. And this is where our rules are not compatible anymore with, but it's not the labour law which is not compatible anymore with the development from China and the US. It's competition policy. We should support the businesses here much more than we have been doing, because the fact that we have those certain rules on state aid, for example, that prevent businesses here to evolve, this is the problem. The problem is not the protection of the workers. So when you hear, for example, that a 20th regime would help startups and innovative business to do better business, and where the Commission has identified that labour law is an obstacle, that fiscal legislation is an obstacle, that insolvency law is an obstacle, I would like very much you to be very critical about those, because it's not about labour law being a barrier. It's far from fiscal policy being a barrier. On the contrary. And I do think here that those elements have been the wrong element to identify, because clearly here what is at stake is to provide businesses with more support, but sustainable support in terms of access to public money with social conditionality. Business have to be very clear. You can't access public money and doing whatever you want and then have to or willing to let off, people and workers just because you're not doing enough profit in one member state and you're delocalizing somewhere else. So I do think here that there is a need for investment in the people, not only in structure, not only in businesses. This money has to be clearly an investment in the people, because it's not on poverty and it's not on in-work poverty that the European Union will grow, and will grow in a way that will be more competitive. Far from that. This is an asset. The workers in the European Union are an asset, not a cost. Labour regulation is not a burden. It's an asset. It's an investment to be done for businesses to be competitive, and for the European Union to move forward as a model, not as a third part in a duo, which is the US and China. And I'm asking you today, will you willing to be a worker or even an investor in China or in the US nowadays or today? I would say, for my side, no. The place to be, the safe place to be, is Europe. The safe place to be to do a good work and to invest as a worker, as a constituency of businesses, and having a strong protections, but also the possibility to have perspective. It's here in Europe. It's not in China and it's not in the US. Thank you.
Just a bit of a planning. So after Lorenzo speaks, we will open up to questions, but also we will allow reactions on the panel to each other. So be prepared. So Lorenzo, so as a person who is knowledgeable about digital and financial sectors, so can you please tell us what is the role that digital and high-tech companies can play in the competitiveness agenda in Europe, and where does Europe stand here?
Sure, and thank you, first of all, for the invitation. Super interesting discussion. I'll just say a couple of words of reaction, which are that, to me, really, the role of tech, digital, and innovative company is exactly that of avoiding that this competitiveness agenda turns into that race to the bottom that has been discussed. In fact, arguably, they are the main tool that, as an economic system, we can use to be able to compete without, while retaining the social and economic model that Europe is and that we should be proud of. I think if we want to rehabilitate a bit the idea of competitiveness, maybe the way to think about it is also that it's not just about its productivity growth, for sure. That's the main point. And I think the Draghi report in then is quite clear about this. It is about productivity growth. Let's keep the concept of competitive in the sense that we should be able to compete in global markets. It should not be only like an inward oriented reflection. Like European companies, after all, they have to be globally competitive. Now, how you achieve that competitiveness is innovation. Because if it's not innovation, is reducing and cutting on standards. And that's why ultimately I care about topics of innovation, tech, because I really think there is a very strong link with social outcomes. So on the question of where we stand on that, let me actually give maybe a note of optimism, which I hope it's useful in this discussion. Optimism on where Europe stands in sort of the global tech race. Now, let me be clear, Draghi is absolutely right. Europe is definitely behind the United States. There is a large gap. However, and this is very important, the European tech ecosystem has been growing and has been growing fast. Let's remember that when we think of tech ecosystem as sort of Silicon Valley style startups and venture capitalists, this is something that just did not exist in Europe 20 years ago. The Silicon Valley was born 60 years before whatever tech ecosystem we have in Europe was born. 60 years is, in innovation is light years. And these are network economies. So the advantages tend to grow because as the network grows, the value of each single innovation is bigger. So let's remember that time difference. And if I'll give you a few numbers, but today Europe does host some of the countries that have among the highest venture capital investment per capita in the world, Netherlands, Sweden, Estonia, and even large core European countries like Germany and France. Companies there raised a few hundred million of venture capital just in the 2008 and 9, and in 2024 they each raised about 5 billion. These are like 10x increases. So we have seen big growth in the metrics, and maybe, to give you some other figures in terms of value, Europe represented about 1%, European companies represented about 1% of the value of companies founded in the 1780s, 15% of the value of companies built in the last decade. So the weight is growing. It's still below what we should be doing, but you cannot just take a picture to diagnose a problem. The trend is very important. And the reason why I say that is that this tells me a couple of important things. The first is that there is no need to get rid of Europe's social model to make innovation happen in Europe. In fact, some of the most successful countries that I mentioned are ones where labor standards are high, collective bargaining has high coverage, arguably labor costs are also relatively high, taxation is high. So that doesn't seem to be the recipe. And the other reason why this trend is important is because it means that we now have something that we did not have 20 years ago, which is the institutional infrastructure for the innovation ecosystem that allows us to press on the accelerator to grow it to a level where we want it to be. Now, there is a big gap, and that gap is largely at the scale-up phase. What does that mean? That means companies that are about 100 employees and several tens of millions of revenues, maybe hundreds of millions of revenues of revenues. So these are companies that want to definitely grow beyond the one country where they were founded. Ideally, they would want to grow in Europe. In fact, they want to be global companies. And why is there this gap compared to the US? Well, there are two main reasons. One is that that the size of the readily available market is smaller in Europe because we are fragmented. So the frictions in the single market are really what's preventing companies from being founded in a market that is big enough to allow them to command the same valuations that an American startup can command. And this has very important implications throughout the funding cycle of a startup. Imagine, I'm from Italy, right? So imagine I found the same company in Italy, 60 million people, or I found it in the United States, 300 million. I can go to an investor and claim a completely different valuation, probably a 5x valuation increase. That makes my funding, raising money, easier from day one. Today, that's not a realistic claim in Europe.
1 more minute.
The second is lack of institutional funding or large institutional funding. More or less, there are 10 times as many large venture capital funds in the US as there are in Europe. And that's something that can be definitely addressed by public policy to some extent. But on this, let me come to my second main point, which is about the importance that building venture capital as an asset class still has in the European landscape. I'll be quick on this, but there is now there are two policy objectives that might be competing in the close future in Europe. One is to continue building venture capital as an asset class, so something that people and institutions want to invest in to get a financial return on, and the other is to direct money towards strategic technologies. My point here is that these two are compatible, but we need to remember that both are important because we will not be able to reach our strategic technology objectives without the contribution of private money to funding innovation. And the other reason why we should not be too precise in trying to direct innovation with public policy is that actually no one really knows how innovation plays out. There are very few empirical facts that have been established in the literature on innovation, but one of them is that entrepreneurial ecosystems work through talent and capital recycling dynamics. So I'll give you a few examples and I'll conclude with those. NVIDIA was started as a chip manufacturer for video games. Which government would direct innovation funding to a video gaming chip company? Amazon. Amazon was launched as an online book platform, right? It now, among other things, basically dominates the market for a critical infrastructure, which is cloud. And I can go on and on and on. So let innovation play out, but put policies in place to ensure that the positive externalities of innovations spread across society, and connecting to something that was said actually in the first panel, use public policy, public procurement, regulation, etc., to make it clear what are the political priorities of the European polity. Do we want to move towards electric cars or not? That's a clear policy priority. There shouldn't be a uncertainty in the market about whether it's a good investment to back a electric car startup. Right now, I feel like in Europe we might be more ready to put public money in a green tech venture capital fund than to be clear about whether we want to move to green tech in the first place. That's it.
Very good. Thank you to all the panelists for this very stimulating comments and discussion. So I will allow you to react to each other, but as a part of our broader discussion. So now, whoever has a question, you can raise your hand, and then everyone has a mic, so you can just press under the mic the button and you can start. So, Lucas, please.
Now it should work? Okay. Lucas Bertram from Zoe Institute for Future Fit Economies. Thanks a lot for the interesting discussion. I sense an apparent contradiction between what I think Patrick was saying about we should abandon competitiveness altogether as a concept, and many other speakers saying that at least as a means to an end. So not as an ultimate objective, but as a means to an end, it's helpful. And I wonder how to reconcile these positions, and I wonder whether especially the differentiation between cost competitiveness on the one hand and technological competitiveness, or differentiation competitiveness as it's often called in the literature, would help there, with the latter being not focused on cutting costs and wages, but rather on productivity, quality, innovation. So the question would be mainly to Patrick whether that's something that would be helpful, focusing on technological competitiveness more as a means to achieving ultimate objectives, or whether you would argue that even that is not helpful and only, as you said, productivity and innovation that are linked to that should be policy goals. Thanks.
We collect a couple of more questions, if there are any. No. Okay. So we deal with this one, but also you can feel free to react to the speeches of each other.
Yeah, thank you, Lucas, for a point that neatly fits into the remarks that I was trying to make anyway. I think when we think about the future of European competitiveness or the economic model or whatever you want to call that, we need to understand what has gone wrong in the past. And my colleague here said that we shouldn't let academic discussions or terminology kind of interfere with good policy discussions, although I come to that in a minute. The main point that Draghi made, which I think was one of the most important things that he has said, was that he, and I looked up the quote, and it said, "The approach we took to competitiveness was a deliberate strategy of trying to lower wage costs relative to each other. And combine this with pro-cyclical fiscal policy, the net effect was to weaken our own domestic demand and undermine our social model." Quote Draghi. And I absolutely share that view, and this was pretty much what my presentation was all about. These academic discussions about competitiveness have real policy consequences. I see that in Germany. We're also talking about, we need to increase competitiveness, which always means that we need to be more competitive than others. We need to sell more than we buy from them. We need to gain market shares, and so on and so forth. And this with current account surpluses of 6, 7, 8%. And if you're running such high current account surpluses, you can't really complain about China using overcapacities, because you're doing that on a scale which is a lot larger than what the Chinese do, even in nominal terms, even though the Chinese economy is substantially larger than Germany. So these academic discussions about terminology do have policy consequences. And when we think about where we should go in terms of future, or in terms of the economic model, of course, we can go with the comparative advantage framework, which was also mentioned here. But of course, this comparative advantage theory is subject to very specific assumptions, often full capacity utilization, which of course is not the case in any economy, especially not right now in Europe. And it's pretty much blind to dynamics and changes, right? I mean, path dependencies, why did some countries get to where they were, is not really explained by it. And where are countries going is also not really explained by it, right? If we were to use the comparative advantage framework to understand the development in China, which arguably is the most important development over the last decades, I mean, if they were to follow that, they would still be a labor-intensive agrarian economy, and not with critically developed tech sectors and incredible innovations. So, and this brings me then to the question again. We need to focus on productivity growth. It was also, this is I think where we agree. Total factor productivity is one critical indicator to measure innovation. But the way in which it is measured, of course, it is a residual, right? What can't be explained by a more efficient use of labor or capital? I mean, this is just basically TFP, and this is then what we say is technological change. So you need to understand what is driving that technological change, and to go to that, Schumpeter is, in my view, the most important economist that delivers answers to that. And Schumpeter, in his theoretical development, started from a model of perfect competition, right? And he was saying that in a perfectly competitive economy, there is simply no innovation, no growth, because the margins are so thin that companies cannot invest, they cannot waste resources, they cannot experiment with things which often go wrong. And this is also what has been mentioned by Lorenzo. we often don't know how innovations play out. So Schumpeter is arguing that you need the right degree of competition and especially the right type of competition, namely a competition that is driving companies to invest rather than lowering their wages. And this, of course, creates then a cycle of economic dynamics where you have high wage growth, high demand. Companies at the same time know that they need to increase their productivity to remain competitive in the market. This then engenders productivity growth, and this is how you get decent economic development and dynamics in. So. Technological competitiveness, I don't know, I'm not that convinced about that term or that we use it as a means to an end. I mean, what I think we need to focus on is how do we increase the living standards within Europe? And I think it's even more useful to consider Europe in a first step, not altogether, but just in a first step as a closed economy. Because when we talk about competitiveness vis-à-vis the US or vis-à-vis China, what we tend to do is that we tend to undermine the importance of the single market, and then we suggest that the distance effect of trade doesn't play any role, which in fact, as I've also shown, substantially does. And of course, in terms of external imbalances that you still have the mechanisms that were laid out, which you can use to prevent other large economic zones from flooding your market. So in that sense, I think that the main focus should really be what kind of economic competition within the single market do we want, and not so much kind of like dragging on in terms of the necessity to increase competitiveness. And another disadvantage, and I'll finish with that, is of course when you just talk about competitiveness and everyone is meaning something different, right? To one person that means increasing productivity, to another one it means deregulation, to another one it means again another thing. You don't really know what you're actually talking about. So I think it would be important to refocus on what is actually needed, and then of course you can talk about technological development, innovation, and so on and so forth. But the obsession with competitiveness, I hold it with Krugman from 30 years ago. I really recommend anyone to read that article because it's highly relevant for today. Is dangerous.
Okay, yeah, Lúcio, please, and.
Many thanks. I would not directly reflect on your question about fundamentally agreeing with the notion that what we are talking here is about mechanisms to potentialize the pass-through of basic innovation to something which has wider macroeconomic implications for our economies. What I would like to address is 2 points that were raised by both Lorenzo and by Isabelle here by my side. We are clearly online on the notion of the importance of having an integrated market in the European Union that enables our companies to both invest and grow. On the absence of that, they will actually do so, just not here. The 300 billion euros that we send every year to the United States, we are not doing this for fun. We are doing this to invest in innovation there. If you go to Silicon Valley and go to a typical company, you're going to realize that a third of the engineers that work in a typical Silicon Valley company actually coming from Europe. Now, I think that the question here in terms of operationalization and in terms of how to implement the Draghi report, I'm not going to mention here the dismal figures concerning implementation from the EPIC barometer in terms of following up on Draghi, but that should be a warning in terms of policymakers. What are the barriers which are amenable to policy solutions that we can apply our limited political capital to try to reduce this fragmentation? I think that there is a significant margin in terms of the regulatory framework, and I'm not talking here only about the regulation, but in terms of harmonization of regulation between European Union member states. I have a small anecdote that I always tell. I have a house in Rome, actually 2 blocks from the Piazza di Spagna. You should not try to connect your computer to an electric outlet in Italy from if you bought it here, simply because the electric outlets have different shapes. That's 75 years after the creation of the common market. We cannot connect our electric appliances from Northern Europe to Italy. So that shows you the type of little restrictions with real economic costs that we are talking about here. This is not only about regulation, it's about effective, harmonized regulation that enables our companies to move between different parts of the common market. That includes also in terms of the financial sector. What you indicated is the pressing need that we have to clearly implement a savings and investment union, something that we have been battling with in terms of European Union policies for the past 10 years. We are relabeling the Capital Markets Union and the Banking Union because we don't have those things. There are concrete things that we should be doing to reduce fragmentation of the single market, which are feasible from the point of view of policy, and that's where we should be concentrating our limited political capital. To my colleague from the social partners, I fully agree with the notion that, A, we are on this together by definition, right? And second, that a key subject must be the investment on human capital in Europe, investment in our workers, because that's one of our greatest sources of competitiveness. Again, I'm using the term. And we are so convinced on that when we did our reaction to the proposal of the European Commission in terms of the MFF, we are fully on board of keeping significant amounts of the European Social Fund Plus dedicated in a ring-fenced way to the upskilling of our labor force. So there are concrete things that we can do with the limited financial and political and policy resources that we can do to ameliorate our fundamental weakness, which is the fragmentation of our vaunted single market.
At this point, I would like to invite other questions, if there are any. This will be our last round of questions. So, Andrew, what?
Yes, hello, Andrew Watt from the ETUC. I mean, I'm very much here in the camp that sees competitiveness, to the extent it's a useful category at all at this level in terms of productivity growth. So the decisive question is what are the drivers of productivity growth? How do we get our productivity growth higher again? And a useful place to start there, I think, might be how do we explain the productivity growth decline that we've had over the recent decades, right? And I don't, that's a very complicated answer to that question with lots of different factors. But let me draw attention to one which I think is under-discussed and maybe get the views of the panelists, maybe particularly of Mr. Vinhas de Souza on this. I mean, Patrick actually mentioned the argument in his opening statement, right, which is that part of the problem is if you go from a situation where collective bargaining, or in the case of the statutory minimum wage for the low-paid workers, the statutory minimum wage sets a floor of the wage level, right? So that means that all companies in that sector in the economy, to stay in the market, they have to invest in raising their productivity, otherwise they go out of business. Once you decentralize collective bargaining, you open up an exit option to companies. They don't have to raise their productivity anymore to the extent that they can force their workers to accept a lower wage or a smaller wage increase, right? So what we do know is that we've had over recent decades, that I've been long enough in the game to witness this, a campaign to decentralize collective bargaining in Europe, and successions of commission presidents and commissioners and heads of central banks, etc., have argued for this decentralization of collective bargaining. I think it was a fatal mistake that was made, a fatal mistake. I see some signs of a correction at the ideological level. I'm very concerned about the possibility that the minimum wage directive will be set aside for legal reasons or supposed legal reasons. I think that will be another huge mistake to be made. Maybe the panelists would like to comment on the validity of this argument and how important they think it is in the broader scheme of things.
We have one more question from Chloe.
Hi, Hi, I'm Chloe, the policy analyst at FEPS on climate. Not being an economist myself, I will attack from the climate perspective. I hear you talk a lot about productivity. I would assume that climate change impacts will have a lot of effects on productivity, whether it is through heat waves on the productivity of workers, or through floods and other natural disasters that can affect different companies. I would like to know more about your take, your opinion, perspective on the links between productivity and adaptation to the impacts of climate change. Thanks.
Thank you. Who of the panelists would like to come in to react to what has been said?
Matthias.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to comment on maybe a few more thoughts. First of all, of course, on collective bargaining, I completely agree that for productivity growth, we need strong collective bargaining. And I think that we've seen the coverage shrinking in Europe, in the member state that I know best, in Germany. It has been shrinking for decades, and especially in the eastern part where I'm from. We have lower coverage, and which also leads to lower wage growth, and which also is associated with lower productivity. So I think that this is one of the examples, that's probably one of the key examples that what Patrick has mentioned as a devaluation, as a low road to competitiveness, which we should not take. I think that's obvious. On climate and productivity, I think that's, on the one hand, it's like a conceptual challenge. So how do economic models, how do they internalize climate effects? I'm not an expert on that, to be honest, but of course it would say something about to what degree can productivity be actually used in the real economic world. So it's not just a potential, but it's actually used on a policy level. I think that we should not set aside our goals on fighting climate change for the reasons of competitiveness, because in the long run, I think it's absolutely clear that we can only have economies that prosper and that provide welfare for all within the boundaries of our planet. I think that's absolutely clear. So I think we should not be confused about that. Maybe a few ideas on how we can gain productivity, because that seems to be one of the basic questions that maybe we all can agree on, that it's a challenge. We need to invest more in R&D, both on a corporate and also on a public level. I think that capital market integration is something that we should care about, because we have a lot of savings in Europe, but it's not sufficiently channeled to investment. I think that skills and people are important, and reskilling, upskilling is an essential thing. And I think that also the unions are a very strong actor in this. And maybe one of the take-home messages for me from that panel was the low level of integration of the European single market that we still have. So we really have to do our homework in the single market, especially now that it's more difficult to access other markets, to exports. We have more and more problems with global flow of trades and services. So we really should do our homework in our domestic market in the European Union, and there's something that we really can do with our policy measures here in the EU.
Isabelle?
Yeah. Thank you. So I do think that what I hear, and I'm happy to hear that, it's about investment in people, investment in worker. And of course, as constituencies of businesses, workers have to have a say. So, and it's exactly where we are for the moment. We are discussing, and I hope I understood, sustainable competitiveness. We understand there is also a willingness to go in that direction and to invest in skill. Of course, skill is important, but it's not the only way and the only element to invest in. I think we clearly have to take on board that the existing protections and workers' rights, and in particular when we look at the minimum wage directive, which has been challenged, but the challenging in front of the court does not prevent a member state to transpose the directive. As long as the decision is taken, the deadline for transposition has to happen and has to be taken seriously on board. It hasn't. Only 8 member states have transposed the minimum wage directive. How come? No, what we are saying is that there is a kind of misuse of what is a minimum wage, and a misuse in terms of, oops, it's going to be higher cost of labor. No, it's not higher cost for labor. It's exactly to prevent social dumping and to raise the level of which the value of work should be assessed. And of course here it's important to replace things where they should be replaced. So investment in wages, investment, of course, in the quality of job. And the quality of job, when it comes to technology, you have to bring people with you to trust the technology. You don't have to use the technology to abuse the workers. We know that the data is, in principle, gold. The data is money, is profit. So how come that you don't give the ammunitions to the businesses to protect their workers for them to use this data while being reassured that they will not be abused? As we've seen through COVID, like tracking, for example, like biometrics, like all of those things that have developed without the consent of the workers. Here we are speaking about abuse of a personal element of the worker. So I do think that here, yes for technology, yes for innovations, but that has to deliver for all. And I think this is where the investment is needed, and this is, of course, the reasons why it's important to have an AI Act. It's important in this AI Act to have recognized the workplace as a high risk. So what do we do after that? We are asking to give us the ammunition to be able to frame that AI Act at the workplace so that it delivers for all and not just leaving the workers aside, and in particular, well knowing that because data is gold, that those data will be used. It's about health and safety. So the value of work, the discussions that we are witnessing in many member states is, we need to be more competitive, so workers have to work more, longer, for the same wage. So we understand minimum wage is something that some member states have in different ways, of course, but they have that. So it will be difficult to come back to this very important innovation for the internal market. So we look at working time. How come? How come that in such a developed society we are looking at this leverage and not looking at where the money is and where the money slips and where the money is not invested in the economy? No? So I do think that here we have to be very much on board. And in terms of quality job, I'm facing for the moment such a reluctance from many angles. And I would also say from the Business Europe side, and I'm sorry to say that because I don't get it. How come that I hear the gender pay transparency, the reporting on the difference in wages, here, the value of work, and the fact that there is a directive that has recognized the need to act, and the need to act now. So we have a directive to reassure and to make sure that there is no difference for the same work between a man and a woman. How come that I hear it's too costly? It's too costly for businesses. And I'm sorry, the 20% difference that a woman has to carry during her life, a professional life, is also something she will have to carry when she will retire. Where is the burden? It's not on the businesses. It's on the person herself. And I think we have to be very clear on that point. So I'm sorry, I'm finishing on the issue of investment, yes. Investment in people, in the workers, yes. But not only on skills, on many other elements where we have democratically adopted regulations that have to be transposed and enforced. And not just, I choose this one and I don't do that one. Thank you.
So we got 2 minutes left and 2 short comments. Please, Lorenzo, you can go first, and then Estelle. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll have to choose. I'll just connect to this. The importance of investing in human capital, I think that's fundamental. And let me be clear, it will be even more fundamental if we do push to increase the exposures of our economies to the type of disruptive innovation type businesses that characterize the Silicon Valley. One of the few things that is very clear is that Silicon Valley-like innovations have very skewed distributional effects. There are relatively few people who work in those companies, and wealth is also very highly concentrated. So for that type of technology to benefit the economy at large, which is, of course, ultimately what we are looking for, we need to have policies in place that, one, help the individuals use those technologies, adopt them to make themselves more productive. And second, to make sure that at the company level, large companies, the public sectors, etc., collaborate as much as possible with highly technological startups to embed in their own business those technologies and therefore increase the productivity of workers. This will need to be done proactively because it's not necessarily going to happen by itself. That's what we have seen in other parts of the world. That's it.
So I will have to sacrifice the single market, which is not good, which we collectively should not do. But once more, unfortunately, that's the lot of the single market. But because I think it's important that I reply on one element, is I don't want people to leave the room thinking that Europe or the Commission has a grand scheme to get rid of the European social model. This is absolutely not the case. We can discuss and argue about the extent to which some of the simplification that you said sometimes, maybe we overdid things, there were overlaps between regulations, some cleanup might be needed. The extent to which this sometimes turns into backtracking or deregulation, that I'm happy to discuss. But there is no plan to say we're going to become competitive by cutting wages, social rights, and etc. I really want this to be clear. And on the contrary, at least from what I can say for my EVP and our portfolio, when we fight for industrial policy, for industrial jobs, it's really for the job dimension. Because these are jobs that are local, so it echoes to the letter, the right to stay. So that people don't have to move countries, regions, but can stay in their region where there are good, well-paid industrial jobs. These jobs are often unionized. So the whole collective bargaining dimension, for instance, that is precious as well, is linked to industrial jobs. And so when we fight for made in Europe criteria, local content criteria, for instance, in public procurement, in product requirements, in corporate fleets, for instance, linked to batteries, steel, and so on, this is really to secure good jobs in Europe. So this is a message that I really wanted to pass, and this is an important focus. It's part of looking at some of the framework conditions that I